Hello, everybody. Just want to thank everybody for joining us today. We will take it slow for a minute to allow more attendees to join us, but we have limited time and we want to make the best use of our time today. This is our July Conversation Lab. Although Pride Month has come to a close, us at the USC Race and Equity Center completely believe that we don't relegate these issues to just 1 month. We talk about them all year. So we have a lively discussion planned for y'all today. Without further ado, I want to make sure we get to our panelists and allow them to introduce themselves, but I will be your moderator for today's session. My name is Dr. Lenita Gregory Campbell. I am the Director for DEI Organizational Strategy here at the USC Race and Equity Center. I use she, her pronouns. For a visual description for y'all, I am brown skin, I have a black shirt on with 2 gold chains, and I have curly hair, and I'm sporting some red lipstick today. So I will pass it on to our panelists. Stefan, would you start us off?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Stefan Lewis. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and qualified supervisor in the state of Florida. My pronouns are she, her. Visual description of me: I am a Black woman with short curly hair, a black blazer, and a huge smile.
Perfect. Julia, can you give it to us as well?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Julia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently an MBA candidate at London Business School. I'm interning this summer with the ACLU. Very lucky to be there. I'm on their equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging team. For a visual description, I'm white. I have short brown hair, some gray glasses on, and a light blue and I think navy blue checkered shirt. And also a big smile.
Hi there, my name is Christopher Pham. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the senior apparel designer for what we call global football, which is a fancy term for soccer at Nike, as well as serving as the co-chair for our Pride LGBTQIA plus ERG group. For a visual description, I am an Asian American man with a white baseball cap, a gray and white checkered shirt over a gray t-shirt because we're very lax here, as you can tell, and a black and silver framed glasses. And I'm sporting also a newly grown mustache because apparently that's the thing to do, so.
Thank you, Chris. Before we truly begin with our team member Brandi leading us off, I just want to remind folks that today our panelists are going to be talking about, one, how businesses can best support their LGBTQIA plus team members and customers, and then second, advocating for the issues that are most pressing to them. So those are kind of 2 frameworks that we'll be talking through today for our session, but I would like to have Brandi introduce herself and also kind of give us some more scaffolding for today.
Thank you, Lenita. My name is Brandi Junius. I'm the Director of Corporate Partnerships here at the USC Race and Equity Center. I use she, her pronouns. And for a visual description, I am a Black woman. I have curly hair kind of in a ponytail going back with some curly bangs. I have some large frame glasses on, some kind of opaque and gold floral type earrings, red lipstick, a navy and white pinstripe dress with like a taupe color blazer over it. And I do want to just give us a little bit of context for today's session. So as we reflect on Pride Month and all of the things that June brought with it, it's important to start this conversation off by saying that the LGBTQIA plus and Two-Spirit community is not a monolith. It is made up of a number of different intersectional identities with unique and individual needs, challenges, and battles. So today's conversation will be situated in the context of supporting this community in the context of work environments, but is not meant to be, nor can it functionally be, a comprehensive conversation on all challenges this community faces. We have a brilliant panel of experts who you just met, who do this work in spaces of employment and other contexts, and they will share their perspectives and experiences with you today. This is not intended to be a complete representation of experiences and identities, but a conversation to allow insight into challenges faced within the workplace and ways to overcome them. We understand the value of seeing oneself represented, and we did our best to bring you a diverse panel while being sensitive to the understanding that some in this community are not yet ready to share parts of their identity with the world. So we're deeply appreciative of the 3 panelists who will be sharing their wealth of knowledge with us today, and we honor the identities they hold as well as those not represented on our panel. Okay, so we want to note that today, during today's conversation, we'll be using what we know to be inclusive language and terminology. However, this does not mean that everyone will agree with the terms used. Language is dynamic and changing, but we live our lives faster than changing language. So these are attempts to be more inclusive. Okay, so with that being said, we want to share what the acronym we are using in today's conversation generally means when we say LGBTQIA+, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual. And the plus can refer to a number of things from agender to demisexual, gender fluid, gray sexual, non-binary, genderqueer, pansexual, omnisexual, two-spirit, and others. We also want to acknowledge the recent attack on human rights that has impacted many intersecting identities within and outside of this community. So when we discuss power asymmetries, leveraging privilege and allyship, we do so understanding that there are many forms of oppression and marginalization, and therefore many ways we can show up for and support our LGBTQIA+ colleagues. Right now, there is a lot of fear around rights lost and rights at stake. So we will have today's conversation in the context of understanding that regardless of differences of opinion, we do not get to deny anyone the right to have their full personhood protected from discrimination and harm. Please keep this in mind as we engage in our different topics today, and also as you navigate the implications of changing legislation, okay? So we can have differences of opinion, but everyone has the right to have their personhood protected from discrimination and harm. Finally, we want to encourage education and training beyond today's conversation lab, and would encourage you to advocate for your company or your ERG to provide education around this topic, or that you do some self-learning around this topic on your own. Please remember, it is not the job of folks in this community to educate you, give you their free intellectual labor, or share their personal stories for your learning purposes. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get into our panel discussion today. Thank you for listening to me. I just wanted to set that context for us all as we have our conversation.
Thank you, Brandi. So I plan to just ask questions. Our panelists will kind of tag team and give us their insights and their perspectives. This is very free-flowing, fairly casual, so I will make space for questions as they come in and comments as they also arise. We will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A function. Brandi will be helping us, making sure we don't miss any of these cues. So we also have planned time in the end for a Q&A for our panelists. So let's get started. I'm hoping that Christopher and Stefan might lend some experience and some insight into our first question. What do you see first as performative? And then 2, what are some of the systems and policies at work that could best support you and make you feel connected and also protected?
I'm happy to take that first. I think it's an interesting word, performative, because especially being in the apparel industry and in like in a company that sells products, performative is like always top of mind. So, when I think about like actions that are performative when it comes to the LGBTQIA+ community, I see it as, the folks that take the really, I guess you could say, the low-hanging fruit, the really easy wins, without doing the back, like the stuff that like sits behind the low-hanging fruit, if you will, or the higher fruit if we want to go higher. I think when it comes to the not sexy part of business, folks that are doing the work in the, let's say the policy, the HR policies in which your employees have to live every day, and your marginalized communities have to live in every day. I think that's where you can kind of see the performative action, seeing a collection that may be queer focused, but nothing on the back end.
I think for me, I was really excited to see that this conversation was going to happen in July. Just because, like, exactly like what you just said, like, it's sexy to do it in June, right? It's fashionable, it's marketable. But as a member of the community, it feels performative, but it also feels opportunistic. And so to have something outside of that, this, I think, would be the definition of not being performative, of actually centering and honoring a community outside of the allotted month that it's given. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah, I like that. I would just elaborate on that. I love that you brought up the fact that it's happening in July, because there's a funny saying that we say here is we're queer all year. It's not just in June. Like suddenly, we don't turn into pumpkins on July 1st and suddenly we don't, we still exist. So I think that's a great call.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also interested though, if, thank you, Christopher, for kind of explaining, what is performative. And we've talked about this through other heritage months and historical months that we celebrate and that we recognize all year. And thank you for talking about what's not performative, some of the work in the back that needs to get done. I'm also interested in hearing maybe Julia or Stefan talk about what is not performative. If people are so concerned about seeming performative, what isn't performative, kind of what Chris was alluding to.
Well, I think for me, what actually helps me feel connected and or protected is when my leadership actually inquires about my experience within the culture, just of the organization, because it's one thing to act a certain way, specifically during June. It's another entirely to want to know, how am I doing here? How are the efforts that are being put forth actually perceived? And to actually be open to feedback.
Julia, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think one thing I would just add in my own experiences is on top of sort of inquiring about how are you doing and what would be helpful, sort of also recognizing that there are things that can be really helpful for your employees that the rest of the world is not going to know about, and that's okay. That there are things that you should be doing internally for your people, for the queer community, that you should be doing them because they're the right thing to do and they uplift and amplify this community, and you're not getting a badge or a gold merit or NBC News press coverage for it, and that because that sort of positive external feedback or news coverage isn't happening, that doesn't mean that that's a reason to shy away from something. So I think about healthcare as a great example. That's something where a lot of organizations, you may not know what healthcare policies look like externally facing. That doesn't mean that having inclusive transgender healthcare coverage isn't incredibly important. Offering same-sex marital benefits and various options for having children, recognizing the burden that can be on certain communities where there are more challenges to be faced from a financial perspective, a social perspective, and so on. And that these are not things that leadership can say, well, could we publish this during X month, or could we promote this with our recruiting population? Could we share this with an analyst class we're looking to bring in? These are things that are on your employees' minds day in and day out. We don't leave our identity at the door when we come. And so we need to know in the LGBTQIA plus community that you're there with us all year, whether or not that sort of merit and that approval from external forces is coming your way.
Thank you, I appreciate that. You gotta do the work at all times without potentially the praise and accolades acknowledged coming in from external factors. I'm not letting you off the hook that quickly though. So Julia, in what ways have you experienced institutional resistance to change? In what creative ways have you tried to overcome it and implement new changes?
Yeah, I appreciate it. Don't let me off the hook. I shouldn't be. So my previous organization before I was pursuing my MBA, I worked at a bank, an investment bank. And myself and a colleague, we wanted to found a Pronouns Initiative globally. So thinking about putting pronouns in email signatures, corporate directory, name tags, a low cost initiative, which I share only because our mindset was one of, this is a way to bring the firm together, This is a way to, center trans and non-binary people who I think are largely left out of both our own community. I identify as cis, but I would say within LGBTQIA plus spaces, we're not amplifying trans and non-binary folks. And also then in turn within society and corporations, we're not doing that work. And so we thought this would be a great way to sort of bring the firm together and also center a community that personally I feel like we leave out and we don't do enough for. And we experienced a tremendous amount of resistance to doing this globally or even at all. Two big reasons. One was just for transparency, leadership had said, the queer community is not that big here. We're a firm of 41,000. And so there was that feedback of, if this is not really going to impact everyone, which is a big misconception and stereotype, we all use pronouns, we all introduce ourselves with our pronouns, regardless of our sexuality and gender. But so the pieces of feedback we'd receive were, one, if this really won't affect everyone, is it really worth doing? And two, perhaps even more disheartening, was that there was a concern that either clients or people internally would not be supportive of this work, would be somehow turned off or uncomfortable with us, announcing that we wanted to roll out a Pronouns Initiative globally. And so to the first point, our way around it was sort of dispelling that stereotype. Pronouns, barring a couple of languages globally where there just isn't necessarily a concept of gender in pronouns, and that was something that we had to navigate globally, but pronouns are used by everyone for everyone, and that level of education was just really important. But our sort of creative way of navigating the second piece was we went through our business principles, 14 in total, and they all centered, first business principle is our people come first. And we stand by inclusion, and we want this to be an employer of choice. That was essentially the language of these 14 business principles. And I think it was a risk, but we went back to very sort of senior kind of C-suite directors and said, are these business principles that someone wrote 30 plus years ago that we don't really believe in? And if so, businesses don't, I think businesses have power and access and capital that could be really transformative in building a more inclusive and equitable world, but they largely exist to make money. And the organization had a lot of cis straight white men at the top. And so our push was, are these business principles that are just written that we don't really believe in, or is this you walking the walk? And is this do you really believe in these? And if you don't, that's okay, but that's information that your employees will probably want to know, to be transparent that this is just work, and we don't really value or see people in that way, in that sort of sense of creating a place of belonging. And that push started a lot of conversations that were able to create a path for us to eventually roll the initiative out globally. I think it was really uncomfortable. I think in this work, people have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. But so that was sort of our way around it, was, do you even believe the things that you're writing and sharing and, using as a recruiting tool, or is this just empty words on a page that you don't stand by?
Stefan, do you have any similar experiences or different, actually?
I'm thinking just specifically about kind of the last part that was just shared about, are you actually walking the walk? Are these empty kind of words? I think a lot about just the hiring processes that I've been through. I show up in the world, I'm a Black woman, and so I have to think, am I being recruited, am I here to check off a diversity box, or am I actually here to support the actual inclusion initiatives of the institution? And so I never really know what that is actually like until I get there. And I've found more often than not, it's been very disheartening to recognize that it's not a part of any sort of walk, but that it's just to take off a requirement.
I'd also be interested in hearing, skipping over some things maybe, to Christopher as well. I mean, what both Julia and Stefan have really mentioned is people act kind of, it's a little full circle, kind of back to the performativeness of, are people actually willing to do the work? And how do we actually still live in a, we still all go to work. We still potentially work for companies or environments that are participating in this, that are very large, where the circle of influence or your sphere of influence may not reach to who's actually making some of these decisions. But do you have any thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I really appreciated hearing Julia and Stefan's point of view. And I think when we think about also institutional resistance, I mean, it's for employee resource groups, I think it's an endless list. I would say, in my experience, one of the biggest pieces of resistance actually comes with not necessarily individuals or individual groups that are pushing back. I would actually probably cite the fact that like a company's scale is probably another form of institutional resistance. Just like, how do you reach, I think globally for Nike, we have around 70,000 employees. Like, how do you reach that? And I know, Julie, you alluded to that a little bit, but what I've found in my experience in terms of ways of operating and like creatively, how do you overcome things like that? I really appreciated hearing Julia's perspective around utilizing the business principles and kind of just being like, I think it ultimately comes down to using your resources and leveraging kind of like your strengths within your community or like with your company to fight and advocate for the change that you want to see. So I think business principles, for example, are the perfect tool. And I think what it requires is actually just reframing. And I think I love the word creative in this question, because I think redefining creativity and reframing how we look at things really opens up the aperture for how we approach institutional resistance. I think within my company, there's a misconception that the creatives are just the people that create product. We have a product creation engine. If you're a designer, you're creative. If you're in brand marketing, you're creative. I don't think that's true at all. I think actually an environment of like innovation and creativity actually should be the cornerstone of any company, because I think if your employees feel inspired and creative, from your accountants to, well, maybe not that creative with accounting or compliance or anything legal, but like when it comes to creativity, people that can apply and look at things differently, I think that's how you overcome institutional resistance and leveraging tools. And it makes me think also, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here, but we talk about diversity and like having diversity in our leadership teams and having diverse perspectives as the best way for creativity and innovation. And I think when you have diverse perspectives, I think that is like, again, the cornerstone of innovation and creativity. So the more for example, sorry, one more example, our employee resource groups have really been staffed, and like our leadership teams have really been staffed by folks in the Nike business. So that we have employees that represent our accounting team, our global finance team, our supply chain, I would say our government affairs team. They're just across the gamut. Queer employees that want to represent the network. Up until recently, none of the design organization was involved in ERG work. And I think as we started becoming, and when I say design, I mean designers like myself or people that work in that kind of creative field, quote unquote creative field. And I think once we've been introduced recently, as a couple of designers have found this work really moving and wanting to partner with our employee resource groups, they've brought diverse perspectives. And they've also, I think the experience has also, for us designers, have opened up the aperture for how we think about product creation by hearing perspectives just within our own company. So I think that is another way that you can leverage your own resources within a company, is just like tapping into the creativity of of your employee resource groups. And that's, I ultimately think, how you'll, overcome a lot of institutional resistance.
I like that. Thank you, Christopher. That's also a really unique way of thinking of what creative actually means and who's allowed or who's permitted or encouraged to be creative. Currently, I think a lot of people don't think of it, that ability to make something legible. Like Julia is saying, you take these principles and let me make it legible to a different group of folks and reframe it in a new way. Let's kind of reconceptualize something. That kind of work is quite creative, but to feel empowered to do so, maybe that's kind of the missing link that people and folks need. I really want to come back to this leveraging piece, but I want to get to this question. What fears and concerns might you have about demographic information regarding sexual orientation or identity being collected by an employer? Perhaps maybe thinking Stefan and then to Julia.
Sure. So for me, I'm thinking just, I think it was like maybe 10 minutes ago that there were protections added to, queer identities. And so I've always been of the mindset, I don't only have one job. I've consistently worked 2 jobs because I live in the reality that at any point I could be fired because of who I am. And so I remember telling one of my coworkers that, and she was stunned because it could not occur to her that she could work in a place that could be unsafe for someone else. So when I do participate in any of these surveys, the reality is that not many of us are out. I work at a conservative organization, and so there are certain things that you just fall in line with typically. But if I do choose to bring all of myself into any of these identifying markers, it's essentially like signing my name to the data. And so anonymity is just out of reach. So of course there are thoughts of what are the repercussions of this? But then also, who am I if I say nothing? Like, who is going to say something if it's not me? It's fear-inducing, but also it behooves me to say something.
I think that fear is so visceral, and I think it's such a double-edged sword in that there's so much power and freedom in openly identifying. It can take so long to get there, to want to identify as a member of this community, that's something that you're proud of, that journey is not easy. And there, for many of us, are a lot of people who don't go the journey with you. And so there's so much pride that should be had in, for myself to check lesbian or to check gay on a form that an employer has. And then there's conversely so much fear that by doing so, and sharing a part of yourself that you work so hard to not only accept, but want to share with others, that other people will, hopefully accept you as well. And that acceptance is also not just the minimum, like that's also not what we're striving for here in any way. I think that's maybe a realistic way to describe where corporations are, but as a community, that's certainly not what we're looking for. But knowing that once that information is shared, I want to work at a place where you're collecting it because you want to look at promotion data and you want to say, are we seeing the same levels of advancement with, queer people as we are with straight cis people? Are we seeing more trans people or more, LGBTQIA plus folks of color leave our firm, than our cis gay, white male employees, and why? And look into that and investigate and do better. And show up for those communities and reframe from what a lot of corporations view as a hiring problem to actually having a retention problem. You can bring people in, they just don't stay because it's not safe and it's not inclusive and they don't feel that they belong. And I think that mental energy that it takes to figure out, do you want this information to be shared? And Stefan, to your point, if you don't share it, who else shares? Who's that next person that's going to make this place safer? I think the fear is your job is where we spend so much of our day. It's your financial stability. For many people, it's the stability of your family or your loved ones. It's something that maybe hopefully you like doing, and to know that all of that can be taken away because you work for someone or someone's who have hate in their heart is a hard thing to bear day in and day out. And that mental energy of having to cover and code switch is not something that it makes you, it's so exhausting. It also just makes you so much less productive from a business perspective. Like you really can't get your job done. And so, I mean, like for me, I don't feel like I pass in any kind of way. I, stereotypically look, quote unquote gay, right? Or as a lot of lesbians do. And so I feel that, checking that box, I'm kind of already owning what's already perceived about me, but it's a lot of trust to have in an organization that information won't be used against you because someone who shouldn't work there does. And even worse so, holds the power to let go of people or to fire people who are, deserving of those jobs. And I think that trust is just not something that's been built with this community. And therefore, it's a lot at stake. Something so small as checking that box that can kind of be make or break in a person's life.
I completely agree. Thank you, Julia. I think as the team was sitting and trying to figure out what questions we really wanted to ask our panelists, and we work as consultants with the Race and Equity Center, is that we thrive on data when we work with companies and work with institutions who want to better build an inclusive environment for their team members and their employees, and we need data. But the question is usually, how are companies and institutions using the data? Are they actually compiling real true data? Are they really getting everything they need? And it's more than just quantitative information, right? So what Stefan is saying is sometimes there needs to be more of just the numbers that we're gathering from employees and team members. And people want to see what it's being used for. They want to build the trust that it's actually going to be used, and they want to see what was actually collected and who's working with the information and how will they help us interpret it? What does it mean? What will it be used for? Hiring, recruitment and retention, promotion opportunities. So that it's a long ways away from actually bubbling in or checking something to where it may be anonymous, right? And a lot of folks haven't reached that point to where they are collecting the right information and actually using it and then speaking back to their team members. So I completely agree that it's not yet built, but it's got a long way to go, and you have to build the trust for folks to want to share that information, anonymous or not, right? This last kind of question, because I want to make sure there are some questions coming in through the chat and then a few in the Q&A. This is for all the panelists, and kind of pick and parse and choose what pieces of the question you'd like, but I'd love for everyone to kind of provide their kind of insights to this. How do you think your unique positionality impacts your experience within the community? And then how do you think others within the community can better support you? And then kind of what Christopher was, he beat me to the punch a little bit earlier, but how can folks in the LGBTQIA plus community with more privilege leverage that to support others? So I'll let whomever would like to. Stefan, they beat you to get off, to get on mute, so you're stuck going first.
It's me. Okay. Well, I think as a masculine of center woman, it's really important for me to address and therefore really work against kind of this toxic masculinity that is often apparent within, like specifically within just the lesbian community. I think that's a privilege that I have, that I feel very responsible, not only to address, but also to remedy just within my corner of the world. I think also really to highlight that even within a marginalized community, there are others who are further marginalized. Like we, as a community, perpetuate biphobia. We perpetuate transphobia. And so for those of us who do have more privilege within our community, then that is our responsibility to really show up for each other.
Julia, we're playing the
Go for it,
game.
Chris.
I really appreciated hearing that, as well as it made me think of kind of what we had mentioned earlier about how do you empower others to feel capable, or how do you inspire others to feel empowered to like take action? I think in their own companies, and I would say, I'll first even caveat this with like I do feel there is a level of like privilege that I sit in, where in a company where we are very we're based in Portland, Oregon, so it's a very left-leaning city and state. The company in and of itself prioritizes diversity, and I do think that there's a level of privilege that I experience also within Nike as like in the design organization. We are treated a little bit differently than our counterparts across the rest of the employee pool. So I think part of the leveraging privilege, I think, is first acknowledging it, right, as like as a member of the LGBT community. At what point do you recognize and acknowledge the privileges that you have and like the different dimensions? And I think from there, that's where you can be, again, inspired and empowered and creative in how you want to leverage them. But if you never recognize your levels of the benefits that you experience, how can you then amplify other voices? So I think that's where I kind of like sit in that kind of space.
I think that like those power and privilege dynamics in our community are so apparent, so as a white cis woman who doesn't have a disability, I have so much power and privilege through nothing that I've done, just bestowed upon me by society. And so within LGBTQIA plus spaces, I feel that for me, centering the experiences and giving, power and voice to queer folks of color, to bi people, to trans and non-binary people feels so important, because in our community, we've just so left those folks behind. People who also, worth noting, these are the leaders of our movement. Our movement began largely with the work of trans women of color, and I think that's a history that even in our own community we don't even really acknowledge or amplify. And so it's certainly not then perpetuated in sort of straight cis spaces. And so I think that kind of feels like my responsibility of using the privilege that I have to create more space and give more platform to those in our community and outside of it who I don't think we've brought along and sort of paid homage to. I think the second part, though, that I would just say quickly of ways to support other people in the community is it's very exhausting to move through the world these days. I think as a human, it's a tiring experience, especially if you are not a cis straight white man. And I think in the community, like for me personally, I leave my house, I lock my door, and if I'm not going to a queer space, the odds that I'll be misgendered are kind of a given. And that's just very tiring to deal with day in and day out. And I think for folks that I would say who are not in the community, a thing that you can do to uplift, and also people in the community, is when you see those dynamics, checking in and also doing some of that work for us is really helpful. So if I'm with other LGBTQIA plus people, if I'm with gay men and we're at a restaurant and the waiter says, to me, sir, what would you like? I mean, I don't even really love ma'am, but certainly prefer it to sir. Saying something so that I'm not always the only person who has to interrupt that, so that, because I think that's a value and dignity I place on myself, and I want to do that work for the next young person coming out, but also particularly in our community, creating more space, especially outside of, as a society, we center sort of gay male experiences. And that's not a criticism, that's just kind of where we are. And I think doing that work for others is really helpful. It's small, but it makes such a big difference, so that it's not as exhausting to be in the world all the time, because you're always preparing for what you'll encounter, what people will say, what you have to combat. And if you can be there and show up in those moments and say, hey, let's not make assumptions about people's genders. Like a small thing, a quick way to interrupt. It just then makes the experience of moving through the world more comfortable and just less difficult. And that's not the bar that I want to be set, that we don't want. I would like us to move through the world where it's safe and loving and joyful, but that's not where we are. And so I think safety and making spaces more comfortable and accepting is kind of where we are. And we have to do that before we can get to moving through the world in a way where you're received, with love and joy. So yeah.
Thank you, Julia. I like that. I really enjoy the interruption. I think, if folks are really acknowledging their interpersonal leverage and working on the one-on-one thing, it helps folks understand they can work on a larger scale. They can push this up. They can work, it's not just for a friend, someone that you care deeply about. This is for a stranger, potentially. This is for someone you work with on your team, in your unit, at your company, university, institution. Like it starts to kind of build up and hopefully kind of give them enough knowledge and empowerment to say, oh, I can, I have the capability, and the onus should be on me to do something as well. So I really appreciate that. We have saved some time for a question and answer period. I'm going to ask for Brandi to come back on screen and help me filter through these questions that I see.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to double click on what Julia said, and just being able to move through the world and being met with joy and love. And I think that's really what we want people to remember and think about when they're thinking about what it means to support people. Like, in what spaces have you shown up and been received with joy and love, and which spaces have you shown up and not? And what that feels like. So I think that's where, for me at least, allyship comes from, that belief that everybody deserves to be met with joy and love wherever they move through in the world. So I love that you said that, and I wanted to double click on that, and really enjoying this full conversation. I will go through the questions in the Q&A first, and then I think we have one in the chat that I'll move to. So whoever wants to answer these, I know some of them as I'm reading through them, we kind of touched on some of them. So, feel free to add as much or as little as you want. The first question is, can you please give an example of an HR policy that you feel is or is not performative? So I know, Julia, I think you talked a little bit about healthcare policy and healthcare coverage as an HR function. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that or elaborate.
Yeah, I'm happy to add to that. I think one experience that we had, which I thought was really, I think, touching on the idea of performative, but then seeing the work on the back end, we were able, I think as an employee resource group, we were able to push our HR team actually to work with GLAAD to draft and create what they called the gender identity and transition policy that was rolled out actually last Pride with our HR team, which I thought was a pretty big milestone and partnership, and actually really creative in how we approached it. I wasn't part of that work, but our other leadership team was. But essentially, working with experts and knowing and acknowledging the fact that we are not the experts, but knowing that this was something that was needed, the HR team worked with GLAAD to kind of create a policy that outlined transition guidelines for employees at Nike, and empowered our people managers with resources and tools to support employees who are gender nonconforming, non-binary, or transitioning, with which I thought was just like really great in terms of like policies that actually support our LGBT community. So I would say like that was a pretty big policy that we rolled out last year. It was really exciting to see.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else want to weigh on that question? We have, I think, 3 more. So there's plenty of space for y'all to add extras.
I would just add on the opposite side of things that are performative is when you have organizations that have policies around workplace discrimination. When those policies exist, it makes people feel, particularly those from marginalized communities, that there's safeguarding in place so that if people who work there who would exhibit discrimination, there would be a process to make sure that sort of your job is safe, to the point earlier about collecting data. But if those policies exist only in a vacuum, and decisions around retention, around the letting go process, firing people, if those decisions are made in a vacuum or made by one person and there's not oversight, there's not a diverse group of people reviewing those decisions, there's not a multitude of data sets being collected, then that policy gives a false sense of security and hope that as you move through the world as a marginalized person, that there are people who are homophobic, who are racist, who are transphobic, sexist, and so on. But you think, I work at a place where if this was my manager or my director, I would be okay. I can check this box on our self-ID form because we have this policy in place. But if that policy has no rail guards and there's no process and there's no oversight, then that's very performative, and almost worse because it creates a false sense of security that people then are even more upset and disappointed to find out when that falls short, because it was never really meant to protect you, the employee. It was always meant to protect the organization, the institution. And I think that's something that having that policy without any other processes and resources in place does a lot more harm than good, and is quite performative in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And that's why we talk about here a lot, the importance of infusing DEI through all facets of the organization and making sure everyone's trained, because you can have great policies in writing, but if managers and supervisors and folks across the organization don't know how to implement them in a fair and equitable way, then like you said, it just creates a false sense that there's some protection here, but the people who are on the ground making decisions have no, knowledge or ability to implement them in a way that they were intended to be implemented. So that's a really good point. Let's move to the next question. The next question here we have is, what are examples of the types of resources you like to see your employer implement or currently have that make you feel protected or safe? So any examples of resources that you'd like to see or that you currently do see that make you feel protected or safe? Or maybe another way to think about this, kind of in the context of the last question we had, is, are there ways that folks are implementing resources or creating environments through the use of resources that feel safe, as opposed to feeling like they're just there but not being operationalized? I don't know if that's a different way to look at it.
I'm happy to answer this one too. I think, sorry, I'm a little chatty, as you can tell. I think with a couple of examples that I've seen, I think are just the ways in which employee resource groups are essentially resourced has been, I think, really encouraging. As a member of our Asian American network, as well as our Pride network, I've been able to see it from like 2 different camps. And then sitting in the other network as well, because all of our networks are open to all employees for allyship. I think it's been really great to see just the entire employee resource group program, if you will, get resourced with actual, whether that's like a budget that increases or with more headcount, because all of our resource groups are actually you have to interview for, and then it actually becomes part of your job function. Essentially, it goes through an HR process where, as an employee resource group, you apply for the role, and if you get the role, you have to have a manager approval to participate. But then once that's cleared and you've accepted the role, 10% of your workload is actually scheduled as part of this work. So I think seeing that as a resource and understanding that like this isn't just a volunteer job, this is actually part, and my manager has signed off on this as like, oh, okay, 10% of his workload is going to be dedicated to employee resource group work. And then, that's an arbitrary number. And, as employees, we're able to make that up ourselves. Sometimes during Pride Month, it's like 100% of my time, but that's another, don't tell my boss. But I do think that like seeing things like that are really encouraging and do make me feel a little bit safer, because it seems more, again, less of a performative action and more of like resources dedicated to our marginalized communities.
Thank you for that. And absolutely, I mean, Nike does an amazing job with the Nike United networks and groups and stuff. And that's one of the things we tell folks too, when we have people that are like, we want to start ERGs, we want to have employee resource groups, and we're just going to have volunteers. And we're like, no, you have to like compensate people. You have to actually give them space in their work day to do this work. It can't be expected to like be loaded over top of 100% of their effort towards their other job. And so I think that I really appreciate you sharing that, Christopher, because that is a good model to actually make people feel safe in that work, versus what we have heard from others before is that, well, I almost feel like I'm penalized for my ERG work, because if it's taking away from my day job, which is what my performance review is based on, and my supervisor maybe doesn't support my work in the ERG, now I'm penalized for interacting in this group and being a part of it, versus, the structure that you just shared. So thank you so much. Does anyone, I'm looking at the time. Let me move us to the next question. I want to get through these last two before Lenita time checks me, because I know that's her job. So this next question, what would be the best way to share or communicate how the information is used? And I think this was referring to collecting data, demographic data. Okay, let's see. And Lenita, if you want to weigh in on this too, feel free to do that.
I think, or I guess as it relates to, if we're talking sort of demographic data that's being collected, people need to know who has it and what is the scope of that data being used for. I think a lot of organizations share, we use this to look at our retention across different demographics. We use this to, figure out different recruiting pipelines we might want to tap into. That's very important to share, but people care first and foremost, who knows this information? Who has this information? Because if you don't know the who, then figuring out sort of the how and what it's used for is a little bit irrelevant, or not irrelevant, but it doesn't paint a full picture. Because the intentions can be good in the sort of how and what it's being used for. But if it's been shared with someone that's not a person that people feel comfortable with, that's something that people should know, and really should know before they fill out the information. I mean, self-ID surveys are largely, volunteer optional based. And I think that measure can create a lot of psychological safety, that we're not forcing folks to fill it out, but people shouldn't find out after the fact, oh, this is with our HR team, who's 2,000 people, right? That doesn't make someone feel good. People need to be able to make an informed decision about, do they want to participate at all? What questions are they comfortable answering? All of that needs to be clearly outlined and communicated before it's sent, so that someone can make an informed decision. And then the other thing I would share is that there should be follow through. So if there are ways that this information is used, organizations should have goals. If you have your employee population is, 10% of your employees identify as Black, you should be collecting that data with a goal in mind. Is that where you want to be? Did you want to boost those, representation of different communities? And then how are you getting there? It's not just, oh, we'd like to see our organization, 15% of people identify as LGBTQIA+. There has to be a plan to get there. So I think collecting the data is like a very first step, and creating that safety around it and transparency is really important. But then a plan should be communicated with the organization of what you will do with the information and how you plan to get there.
Thank you so much for that. Lenita, do I have time to do this last question? And I think maybe this is one that you and I can weigh in on, or we can ask our panelists. But the last question I have is, what do you do when a company doesn't really want to gather the data? And again, I think this is related to the demographic data we were discussing. And so if I were to just weigh in on this a little bit, I would say that I know, like, we work with different global organizations and different global clients. And so sometimes the laws, the legal policy around collecting certain information is different. And so I'm not going to speak about it in that context. If there are, legal reasons why folks aren't collecting certain demographic information, that's not what I'm talking about. But I do think it kind of goes back to, well, what are our values? What are our goals? What are we trying to do with this information? How can we say something is important to us if we don't even have the data to tell us how we're measuring up in this area? So I think it's kind of, turning the lens back on the organization and saying, well, what is it that you're trying to achieve? Because, and again, we're a research center, so everything is about data. Like, what information do you have to tell you if you're doing well or not in this area? And if you're not willing to look at it and collect it, what does that say about your dedication to making change on this particular issue? So I don't know if anyone else wants to add. Lenita, I'm going to turn it back over to you if you want to have the panelists ask, but yeah.
No, I completely agree with what Brandi said. And in general, I will always say having folks be skeptical about or hesitant to not gather the data means that we can't use anecdotal experiences that senior leadership may or may not know about almost no one in their company. This is important, and kind of what Julia mentioned, we go in with a plan first. The plan first has complete accountability and transparency in this for every team member or employee at a company or an institution. That is first and foremost, and we lay everything out. And I think that's the kind of the key point. You can't move forward without having that key information and having everyone as a stakeholder in this. Before we exit, I want to say thank you to our panelists for taking this time out and chatting with us. We extremely appreciate it. Thank you for our registrants and our attendees for coming and spending this time with us as well. We really want to make these conversation labs monthly an opportunity for folks to gather information in a very casual manner, be exposed to different thoughts and ideas and perspectives. It really helps kind of broaden a base of understanding for folks as well outside of certain months, and with kind of a dynamic topic that includes what's going on in the world, right? None of us are living in a vacuum, at least I hope we are not. Please keep an eye out for information regarding our upcoming conversation labs, the first Wednesday of every month. These are dynamic and the topics change, and we really try to make them as provocative and informative as we can, and really bringing different information and news to y'all. So I will, Brandi, if there's anything I forgot to mention.
No, I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists as well, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So again, thank you, everybody. Please keep an eye out for information for registration. Would love to see you back here for upcoming months and upcoming conversation labs again. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.